So a little bit of background aside from that biography that I wanted to share is I started becoming interested in Chile as an undergraduate. Partially what was mentioned there, I was interested in the U.S. influence over the past several decades in the country, specifically the neoliberal economic policy that the U.S. promoted there. So in 2016, I began studying in Chile. I studied there for a year, political science as an study abroad student. And then I've been back several times since then for various projects and other occasions over the past several years. I guess technically it says, oh, I didn't change the slide. There we go. Is it just this? Okay. It says 7 years. I guess it's 8 years now. But this is sort of a new area of study for me because in the past, I have been looking at poverty reduction policies. And so as a grad student, I'm trying to look more into issues around environmental governance, environmental justice, looking at water and agriculture specifically. So these are sort of new themes for me as a student. An overview of my trip this summer, I spent about 10 weeks in Chile from June to August. And I spent 5 weeks in Santiago, mainly doing archival research. And then I spent the second 5 weeks in Coquimbo, which is a drought-stricken region in north central Chile. Here's a picture of the Coquimbo region on the map. That white dot is the, wait, next slide, I guess. Back. Let me see if this actually, oh, it does work, okay. Yeah, this white dot is the city of Coquimbo, which is where I was staying. And this picture here is of like the Central Valley, which is an important agricultural industry for the country. During my stay though in Coquimbo, my project actually took on important change, which I'm going to talk about going forward. But first, I kind of want to set the background for the water politics of the region. These are 3 factors that I'm going to talk about that are influencing and putting pressure on water supply in Chile. So the country has been going through a drought for many years, but specifically in the last 15 years, scientists have classified the conditions there as a mega drought. Precipitation has declined by about 20 to 40% on average every year since 2010. And the Central Valley, which Coquimbo is a part of, is one of the main areas affected, potentially the place that's going to face the worst consequences, and it's home to about half of Chile's population, 10 million people. This graphic on the right here shows the main reservoirs in Chile, and as of February of 2024, the overall capacity was down to like 6%. And so this is a very dire crisis. When I was there was a significant rainfall that changed these numbers, which many people were happy about, but it's going to be only a temporary fix there. Okay. One of the focal points of my study is the 1981 Water Code, which is sort of the cornerstone of water law in Chile. It's been amended a few times in the last several years, but the main components remain the same. And many scholars point to this 1981 Water Code as a major factor in shaping the impacts of scarcity in the country. It was an artifact of the Pinochet military dictatorship, and was the drafting of the law was assisted by the Chicago Boys, who famously were a group of Chilean economists who were trained in this sort of free market school of economics that promoted deregulation, privatization, what we today call neoliberalism. And water policy was one of the many areas where they left their mark in Chilean society. And so the code itself, what it does is privatizes water resources, treating them as a private good that can be bought and sold like any other commodity. And actually, the water rights of each individual are registered in the same place that like real estate is registered. So it's very much looked at as property. And the theory behind this is that, at least for the economists that drafted this law, their proposition was that the market will ensure the best and most efficient use of these resources. However, today, many scholars will argue the opposite, that this has actually led to overdrawing on the resources and put a lot of strain on the water system. And in a practical sense, the quantities of water are expressed in shares, like a stock would be expressed, and they're actually separated from land and water are decoupled under this policy, which is one of the most notable aspects. And so I can own shares of a river in a place where I don't own land. There are people who have entire rivers who have rights to entire rivers. They don't own any of the land around it. They might live in Santiago, and they own water resources, maybe in some of the most productive agricultural areas, for example. This is quite common. And again, they can be bought and sold on a free market. The last important factor, and especially for the Limarí province, which is where I'm studying, is the agricultural industry, which I've already mentioned a few times. So it is the primary employer in the Limarí province, and agricultural exports are the second most important export behind copper in Chile. So this is a very important industry. If you go to the grocery store, even in Madison, you'll find specifically fruits that are imported from Chile. It's not uncommon to see here. And in the Limarí province, table grapes, avocados, and citric fruits are some of the primary crops that they grow. And as you see from this third bullet point here, the amount of irrigated land is going down over the last 14 years. This is a direct consequence of the scarcity. People are migrating out, finding different places to farm, and the land isn't as productive, of course, without as much water. So, given this background, I was interested in sort of what the government was proposing to do to address these issues. I was specifically looking at desalination. I wanted to look at desalination technology, which was a solution being proposed by the government to alleviate scarcity, raise supply, in this case, by treating seawater so that it can be used for human consumption. I found this interesting, though, because this is a very energy intensive process, and also it takes many years to build these plants when the crisis is very acute right now. Maybe it's good for building long-term capacity, but to address the current crisis, I was interested in why this was being promoted. And they announced in Coquimbo earlier this year that they would build the first ever plant for human consumption in Coquimbo. There's one, I think, in like the mining in Antofagasta in the north, but this would be like the second plant in Chile that would go for human consumption. But immediately the agricultural producers started lobbying to get some of that water to come into the interior valley, which was another important element of this dynamic. And so when I left for Chile in June, these were my research questions that I was hoping to address. Again, the 1981 water law figures prominently in the study, but I also wanted to understand what were the logics behind the government's implementation of desalination technology, and then also how would the like physical infrastructure impact the community where it was being built. So you can see in this picture, it's right outside the capital city of Coquimbo. You can see those blue dots down there is where the desalination plant was going to be located. There's people living there. There's also some endangered flora and fauna, not to mention some of the impacts that desalination has on the ocean ecosystem. So this was sort of the line of research that I was going down when I came to Chile. So the first 5 weeks I spent, as I mentioned before, mainly in the archives. This is the National Library, which is where I spent most of my time looking at a lot of legal documents related to the 1981 Water Code. I was also able to conduct some interviews about desalination with various officials, elected officials, lawyers, academics, that sort of thing, to understand the general water policy landscape. And while I was able to review a good number of texts and materials that, sorry, I keep forgetting to change the slide. Well, I was able to review a good number of texts that I couldn't have accessed without going to Chile. I was hoping to find more like unpublished materials which is not what I found in the archives. However, I did find this book outside of the archives that was drawing on some of the materials that I was hoping to find. And so I ended up talking to the author of this book, who basically said that the pictures here are notes from the military junta, like in the meetings where they were drafting the policy, which was really what I was hoping to find. But they essentially said they can't disclose the source of these notes, but that they were from somebody who was directly participating in these meetings. And so because of the nature of the dictatorship, a lot of these materials did not make it into the public archives. And so a lot of what we see here is held privately, which is sort of another obstacle of the study, but it was really instructive to see the way that they drew on these sources in the book. And so I can at least get some sense of what types of conversations were happening within the dictatorship. So moving on to the second phase of my study, the second 5 weeks in Coquimbo. I initially had a hard time finding the right, getting in touch and scheduling interviews with the people related to desalination infrastructure. And so early on, I met with a friend of a friend who was a small scale farmer in the interior of the country, in the Limari province, which I talked about earlier. And she was the secretary of a Consejo Campesino, which was essentially an organization that that advocated for small farmers and subsistence farmers. And they had been discussing in their meetings what the desalination technology might mean for their scarcity crisis that they were living there. But it became clear that these kind of questions about the new supply of water coming potentially from the ocean were very much secondary to some of the more urgent governance concerns that they were having as small farmers in the area where they were living. And so desalination was eclipsed by things that they felt were brought bigger impacts on their daily livelihoods. And so a few days after our meeting, I actually got a call from this contact, and they basically proposed that I do a study with them in collaboration with their organization. They wanted to document what impacts the scarcity crisis we're having on the broader governance structures, which from what they told me were working fine until scarcity came into play, and then it caused a whole host of issues that they don't have the time essentially to document and understand where they can intervene as an organization. And so that ended up being the project. I decided to take on this project, especially because it was emerging from local concerns. And they contacted me. I felt that it would be worthwhile to pursue this line of questioning. And so my new research question became, for the last 4 weeks of my trip, essentially, how is the scarcity crisis impacting water governance in two main river basins, which were the Rio Grande Basin and the Rio Mostosal Basin. And despite the concerns raised by my collaborators, I'm hoping that framing the question in this way will allow me to get at least a more objective picture of what's going on, interviewing stakeholders across the spectrum of landholders there. And in those 4 weeks, I was able to carry out more interviews. I had a much easier time getting in touch with people in the government, especially related to this issue, than I was for desalination. But here is the new study site. So this is the Limari province, just a little bit south of Coquimbo, where I was going to study the desalination issue. And then together with the Consejo Campesino, we decided to study the management situation in again, two different river basins with their own separate governance structures. So here you can see the Rio Grande delineated by these two yellow arrows. And then we have Rio Mostosal right there where the red arrow is. Here are some photos of Rio Grande that I took. The interesting thing about this watershed is that it's a more diverse group of stakeholders. So this is in terms of like the farm size, but also the numbers of shares of water rights that they own. On the right here, you can see this is one of the main reservoirs that was depicted in the earlier infographic. It's also part of this river, and so it makes it somewhat more complicated, but also interesting to study because this reservoir has its own governance body as well. This is Rio Mostosal, and it has a more homogeneous group of stakeholders in terms of the farm size. And so we were kind of hoping by designing the study like this, we'd get a better representation of the different types of stakeholders on these waterways. But I'm just going to give you a brief overview of what the governance structure looks like. This is broadly the case in Chile generally, but this is specific also to what I'm studying in the Limari province. And so the juntas de vigilancia are the main governance organizations at the river level. So each river has a junta de vigilancia. The members of the junta are anyone that owns shares of water in that riverway. And they elect a board of directors, and the voting is done based on a 1 share per vote basis. And so you'll have small farmers that might have like 1 share of water, and you'll have larger farmers with like 7,000. And so what ends up happening is the large shareholders will just elect themselves to the board. So that in itself is problematic, a dynamic there. And just a quick note, they measure shares as like 40 liters per second is like 1 share. And that the amount of time that they're able to open their their canals is a different subject, but that's more or less how they measure the shares. And so the Junta de Vigilancia is mainly tasked with administering the distribution of water and then also managing like infrastructure, whether that's like maintaining it or building new infrastructure in the waterway. And then you have the Comunidad de Aguas, which are these are the canals that come off of the river. Each of the canals that go in to irrigate the fields have their own governance body that is nested within the Junta de Vigilancia. And so everybody who's a member of the Junta de Vigilancia is probably a member of a Comunidad de Agua that's a more micro governance scale. And then finally, you have the Dirección General de Aguas, which is the DGA, that's the government organization. And because these other two organizations are private entities, they really have a limited regulatory role, but what they try to do is enforce like any violations of the law. So like overdrawing water, stealing water, they try to like investigate that and issue fines, that sort of thing. But there's this real tension between like what the government can do based on the way that these organizations are structured under the 1981 law. So most of the time this works, it's pretty frictionless. When there's a lot of water, everyone gets their fair share, so to speak, corresponding to the amount of shares that they own. But under the scarcity conditions, which is more and more the case now, the government, for example, in particularly acute moments, will declare a situation of emergency. And then in that case, the Juntas de Vigilancia have to create a new like redistribution plan. And since this happens like almost every year, they have like 6 months to like come up with this plan. Administratively and logistically, it seemed really complicated. But what ends up happening is they like prorate the shares based on how much water is available in the river at that point in time. So if the river's at like 50% capacity, everybody gets 50% of their share. That's about as much as I was able to learn before I left. And so this is sort of the dynamic that I'm looking to study specifically, is like what happens with these redistribution agreements, what types of politics emerge under these conditions. And so I am planning to go back in January to actually conduct like the main interviews on this particular topic. We're speaking specifically with farmers and water users in these two waterways. I'm hoping to conduct 15 to 20 interviews. Pretty ambitious, probably within 3 weeks, but that is my plan going forward, and that is how I hope to address this specific topic. The desalination infrastructure piece is probably going to be put to the side. I think that I'm going to focus mainly on this, especially since it's a master's project. So those are my plans moving forward. Thank you, Lassies, and thank you to Tinker-Nave for the support on this project, and thank you all for listening to the presentation. Happy to answer questions whenever that's appropriate. Oh, I guess my slide never showed.
Next up, we have Fidel, who is un gran historiador, very good historian dedicated to studying development and crisis of higher education in Peru through the last graduate program. He received his BA in history in 2015 and an MA in superior education in 2021, both from the Universidad Nacional de San Agustín, UNSA. Likewise, he has been dedicated to teaching for almost 7 years, teaching in schools, pre-college centers, and in the Universidad Nacional Jorge Basadre, Roma. He is the recipient of several academic awards, including those resulting through his work advising students. Previously, he traveled through Latin America as an exchange student and participated in many academic events. Through UNSA, he was awarded funding to study mining communities and develop research projects. And today, he will be talking about education under attack, history, evolution, and crisis in the higher education system in Peru.
Okay. It's a pleasure to stay here and share my research with everybody. And in this case, I will talk about my research in Peru, but first I introduce a background about the first universities in Peru. Now, we know that in USA now we had about more than 4,000 universities and colleges, but in the case of Peru, we had the following universities. We had Universidad Nacional Mayor de San Marcos, was the first university founded in America, in the whole continent, in 1555, Universidad San Cristóbal de Huamanga, 1677, but was closed in 1876, and Universidad Nacional San Antonio Abad del Cusco, 1692. It's interesting because during the colonial period in Peru, we only had 3 universities. But in the independence of Peru, in 1824 was founded Universidad Nacional de Trujillo, but was closed in 1876, and my former university in Peru, Universidad Nacional de San Agustín, in 1828. What is interesting here that we had 5 universities during the 19th century, but 2 were closed. So at the end of the 19th century, Peru only has 3 universities. So this is very worth taking into account that Peru was the biggest empire in South America, not especially ruled by Spain. So now we check a little of history. We check the reforms and period and action and context. During 1855 and 1876, the idea of the state was separate the state from the church, so that universities were founded by religious issues, whereby religious people try to be more controlled by the state, and also the reforms in the crisis that Peru experienced during that years obligate to the state to close 2 universities. But later, in 1918 was an important year because the reform of Cordoba happened in Argentina. That reforms had the idea of, okay, a university need to serve to the population, need to serve to the classes. A university cannot be a place for aristocracy or a place for people who had money and power. So they demand more like the liberalization of education. In 1927, we had the crisis at the University of Cusco or University San Antonio Abad, because students and former Peruvian thinkers of that age claim more rights. They claim that the university open to the mass population, not only for aristocracy. In 60s in Peru, we had Velasco government. He was a military president who tried to foment the research outside the university, create some institutes and to promote the university, the research outside the university. In 1983, we had the University Law 23733. That's interesting because the idea of that law was promote the university for popular sector and reduce the role of the state in the university. And during that year, the National Assembly of Rectors was created. The idea was, okay, provide more autonomy to the university. In that assembly, be in charge of providing or authorize the opening of more universities. In 1996, during the government of Fujimori, some people said, the legislative decree 8082 was released that allowed to universities have for project, and that was the mercantilization of higher education in Peru. A lot of universities appeared, but the quality decreased a lot. So the Peruvian state want to solutionate that, and they released the University Law 3220 that try not to control more that universities, to regulate them, create a SUNEDU. This was the institution who want to regulate that, but well, at least try to get or obtain more minimal quality standards for the universities. Well, during my stay in Peru, I do archival research. I try to research in different archival in Arequipa and Tacna City. So it's interesting the case of 1928, during the government of President Leguía in Peru, he promulgated a university statute. But that university statute takes away the autonomy of the university. That university statute separate the participation of the student from the university. And one year, during that year was the centenary of my former university in Peru. And what happened? The chancellor, the rector, renounced during that year. This is from the newspaper El Deber in August 1928. And later, another counselor arrived. He was Edmundo Escomer. He was a famous doctor in Peru. But well, that situation spoiled the celebration of the centenary of UNSA or National University of San Agustin in Peru. So they need to postpone the celebration for the next year. But we realized that political ambience affect to the universities 100 years ago. Well, and the first wave of new universities during the 50s and 60s was the biggest immigration process in Peru. People from the rural areas start to immigrate in big amounts to the cities such as Arequipa, Trujillo, or Lima, the capital, increase the population, and the new people demands more education, demands access to the university. So during 1955 to 1984, 22 public universities were created. No, this is a big number. This is the big number of universities created, no, in Peru, public universities especially, and only 14 private universities. However, we arrived to the government of Fujimori. No, he was a former president. Well, this is an interesting fun. He studied, for example, in UW-Milwaukee. Yeah, he's an engineer, but he became president of Peru. And 1996, he released that decree because the idea of neoliberalism, the School of Chicago was, okay, private sector need to take care of the people. Private sector can provide access to the education. Private sector is or private universities are the solution for our lot of universities. No, well, during the period between 1996 to 2014, 63 universities were created. So in 18 years, half of the universities of Peru were created. No, in 2014, in Peru exists 143 universities. Well, this is a big amount taking into account the context of the region. But most of that university didn't have the minimal quality standard or requirements. Well, in Spanish, we say universidades de garaje or garage universities, but they don't provide any quality. In 2014, the law 3220 was approved. The SUNEDO started to try to regulate that university to try to set the minimal standards. And well, when I was in Arequipa and also tried to research about the pre-college centers, this is, the name in Spanish is academies, because they try to prepare students for access to the university, because the public system, educational system in Peru, especially in higher education, is not too good. It's really, really bad. So most of the students who want to have access to the university spend maybe 1, 2, or 3 years preparing for the university in the academies. No, they are very common in Peru. And the problem is the public university cannot have enough spot for all the new students, because in Peru, public universities are almost free. No, you pay about $30, $40 per year for that is the tuition per year. Right? But the problem is only a limited group can access to the public education in Peru. So, for example, in my university in Arequipa, the acceptance rate is about 9 to 10%. So this is similar to some prestigious IB college. No, that is the acceptance rate of the university. So exists a very big amount of students who cannot have access to the university and need to get debts or need to work for applying to private institutions. When I was in Arequipa, I talked with some professor and even though some historians about what is the ancient academy in Peru, the pre-college center in Arequipa, especially in the city when I conduct most of my research. And most of them are agreed that they say the most ancient academy was founded in 90s, other people the 80s. But when I conduct my research, I realized I have that academies, I found a news about from 1844, and this one from 1984, and I saw, oh, your academies are very ancient. Later I found another news from 1928 in the middle. And later I found another news from 1899. So the preparation for a student from the university or that center maybe appeared always in 19th century. They are very, very old. So, but no one historian in Arequipa or even no educator research about that. Well, what is the condition of that universities? What created during that period, 90 at the end of 90 decade, sorry. They had bad conditions, and some famous people and politicians attend to that university. This one is Patricia Benavides, and he's studying in one of that university. The university he obtained a doctorate in only 1 year in that university without PA, without thesis. People going to the university, where is that thesis? Because she became general attorney of Peru, and he earned master in 1 year and doctorate 2 years, master and doctorate. I really envy her. But that is the condition of that universities. And this one, maybe some people didn't know, maybe other one. He was the former president of Peru, Pedro Castillo. Now he's in prison because he attempted to do a coup d'etat and failed. But he studied in one of the Christian university, and he was a very homophobic person. But he has a thesis about racial equality in school. So no, gender equality in school. So in the thesis has 54% of plagiarism. So most people suspect that he didn't do a thesis. He made a thesis with ChatGPT. I don't know, but that is the idea of that universities. Another case is about the chancellor of the University Garcilaso, or the other university founded without regulation, and he earned 2 million soles per month. That's equivalent to $500,000 per month. He earned more than the chancellor of Harvard, Yale, or Stanford. That's insane because that universities didn't pay taxes, didn't have enough regulations, and the people who found that university made very rich in a short time, in detriment to thousands of youth Peruvians. And this is another caricature that represents, this is one of congressmen who is with a black tweet, trying to say, okay, you cannot get permission without control. And the director of the former National Assembly rector, yes, I can because autonomy allow me that. No, you said that Garage University, no, university that function in a 2-floor of houses, no, university without campus, universities in bad condition, and sometimes the reality go beyond the fictions because we have that cases of that kind. Checking that image, this is one of that universities. In theory, the university has 7 floors, but well, 3 floors are real, the others are fake floors, no? This is a false facade in that university. So this is, well, maybe they scan students, they scan to the people, but they are no limitation on this, no regulation. And this is other university. Now, this is the biggest private university in Peru, taking into account the number of students, the UTP. And they fire professors who try to unionize. And what's interesting here with that university belongs to Carlos Rodriguez Pastor, the richest man in Peru. So these are very profitable. No, I don't know. Maybe I will issue a good business for them. No. Well, finally, the educational control reform. He is Jaime Saavedra. He was a famous education minister who tried to support the role of the SUNEDO, the institution who regulate the universities. He even though was received a lot of that knowledge for develop a good job. However, due to political issues and obviously people who has interest in the universities, he was censored in 2016 by congressmen. No? And most of the congressmen had interest in that universities. Now, Jaime Saavedra is the person who leads the education, well, he works in the World Bank, no? And led development for Latin America. No? He's a very famous and respectful man, but well, in Peru, we fired, no? In 2021, many congressmen were elected and they had interest in that private university. They lobby against the SUNEDU, the institution who regulate that universities. In 2024, at the beginning of the year, Manuel Castillo, well, if the surname is Castillo, we cannot expect something well from him, but well, he was elected head of SUNEDU, and he had conflict interest because he worked in that universities who were regulated. So you contract the people who works in the university that you had to regulate. That's very insane, but well, Peruvian Congress do that. In July 2024, SUNEDU approved permanent licensing to the universities because when a university obtained a license from SUNEDU, was temporary for 5, 8, or 10 years, and after that period, SUNEDU go and try to supervise again the university to secure the university has the minimal standard of quality, but now this is not possible because if you get the license, that license is for the entire life, no? It's lifetime license now. But the problem extends also to public universities. For example, in San Marcos, the student protest against the chancellor. They want the chancellor were fired because he organized elections and he eliminated all the candidates. So only one candidate in the election. This was a bad situation. So a student take the control of the university, and the chancellor admit, well, I have some security people who take against the control of the university. Well, he hired bandits not to bet student, to expel student, and take the university. No, the situation is really bad, especially because San Marcos is the flagship public university of Peru, and the situation is not well in that place. Well, finally, I want to thank Tinker-Nave and LASIS program for support me. I can present my research in some different universities in Peru, even though in some local TV channels, and that is possible with the support of the UW and Tinker-Nave. Thank you so much for your attention.
Last but not least, we have Jacob. Jacob Sorrells is also in Masters. He's in his second year. He is a good friend. And he is completing his MA with a focus on refugee and migration issues. So prior to Madison, he spent 4 years as a bilingual case manager in Denver, where he worked primarily with refugees experiencing homelessness. Always the mysterious man, he's lived in Ecuador, Argentina, and Colombia, where he engaged in various odd jobs and educational endeavors. And his presentation today is titled Sanctuary or Segunda Selva, Engaging Migrant Experiences in Denver, Colorado.
Thank you, Francesco. It's very rare that I get an introduction for anything, so I figure I might as well stand up to celebrate the occasion. Okay, so for a little background, Denver is where I lived before coming here, has become a destination for about 41,000 migrants, primarily Venezuelan migrants, since around October 22. This makes the city of Denver the greatest recipient of Venezuelan migrants per capita of any city in the United States. In part, this is because geographically, Denver is the closest liberal metropolitan area to some of the busiest ports of entry on the southern border in the United States, just about 10 hours due north of El Paso, for instance. So this means a cheaper bus ticket for migrants, who'd often hear about Denver's pro-migrant disposition via word of mouth. This was confirmed in a lot of my interviews. The location also means a cheaper option for states wanting to get rid of them. In 2002, Texas Governor Greg Abbott infamously started busing thousands of migrants to so-called sanctuary cities, above all, New York, Chicago, and Denver, just sending them en masse, often without any coordination or even advance notice, just like in the middle of the night. In response, the Denver city government has really celebrated itself for its policies of welcome. So we have Denver Mayor Mike Johnson saying multiple times in a number of different ways, Denver will not just survive, but will thrive with newcomers arriving. They've allocated over $340 million in assistance in the absence of any support from federal or state government. And there's also been a lot of significant grassroots support in local communities. But my investigation hoped, this is just like the headlines, right? My investigation hoped to piece together reality from the ground. Therefore, to put this relatively welcoming picture of Denver to the test as it is lived by migrants themselves. So drawing on needs assessment, integration, and context of reception literature, my broad research questions going into the summer were, how do newcomers perceive and navigate the terrain of new cultural, material, and legal challenges in Denver? In what ways did their prior knowledge and expectations prepare them for or otherwise complicate this transition? What role do various local institutions play as newcomers pursue their basic needs and higher aspirations? And finally, moving forward, how do local actors help foster conditions more conducive to migrant well-being and success? So this was ethnographic fieldwork that revolved around two overlapping methods, support work and observation on the ground, and semi-formal interviews. So on the ground, I was translating at TPS workshops, as temporary protection status workshops for migrants, volunteering weekly at a neighborhood resource center called All Souls, and above all, doing direct outreach work in loose collaboration with this organization called Housekeys Action Network, an anti-homelessness community organization that had launched a migrant support initiative, right? So here I was really drawing on, my experience, my prior experience in human services, most of the time, assisting folks in everything from helping find housing, jobs, legal support, medical benefits, to mediating disputes between migrants and non-Spanish speaking landlords and neighbors. My primary place of operation was the glorious White Rock Motel trailer park, which featured about 50 odd trailers, populated predominantly now by Venezuelan families. Each designated trailer space, a skinny slab of grass, gravel, some broken concrete, and with a sometimes reliable electricity and water hookup, was or cost a whopping $1,100 a month. And there was no contract, so the property manager, who did not take kindly to the Venezuelan residents, could just raise the rent and evict migrants at will, which he often did. And to put it in perspective, $1,100 could easily cover a far more spacious one-bedroom, possibly even two-bedroom apartment in the city of Denver. Moreover, many of these families actually had housing vouchers issued by the city to cover a first month's rent and a security deposit. So why is it that they would purchase these old, dilapidated campers for maybe like $2,000 or so, before then paying an arm and a leg every single month, just for the plot that it sits on? Well, because temporary rental assistance, however well-meaning, is completely and utterly useless if people aren't accepted for apartments in the first place, right? So while the city was working with various landlords to relax standard application requirements for apartment applicants to be more accommodating to the migrant newcomers, there still did appear this big gap in availability. I couldn't get the actual numbers, but it's clear that many people just weren't able to redeem these vouchers before they expired in July, due to these obvious structural changes, or these obvious like structural challenges, right? So this means we had, there's a lot of people just living on the street, and others, who negotiated these precarious, often exploitative sort of third options, like trailer parks. There was one woman who I got to know there who remarked, "Estamos aquí en este pequeño trailer, 8 personas durmiendo uno encima del otro. Más con 2 o 3 de estos pagos mensuales, uno podría comprar una casa en Venezuela, muriéndonos de hambre adentro, claro, pero una casa." I appreciated her. She had a very dark sense of humor, but she was a character. This is a picture of a pair of families that I worked with consistently throughout the summer. Just really wonderful people, who were originally living in these tents when I first met them. With the help of some funds that we raised, were able to purchase 2 trailers in aforementioned trailer park, theoretically with the goal that that would just be a temporary, first step to a longer solution, or a longer term solution. Okay, so moving on to my interviews. So just my sample at a glance, I interviewed 12 folks. The interviews lasted about an hour and 20 minutes apiece. 8 women. There were 8 women, 4 men. The median age of interviewee was 28 years old. They had all averaged about 6 months in Denver at the time of the interview. I met 5 of them in the trailer park, 5 of them at the resource center, and 2 of them at the TPS workshops. And at the time of the interview, 4 of them were living in trailers, 6 in apartments, and 2 of whom had actually graduated from the trailers before living in those apartments. One couple was living on a friend's couch after losing their apartment, and another, far and away the most desperate case, was a family of 4 living in a 2001 Toyota Sienna, very pregnant with a 4th child on the way. It was a difficult situation for some in particular. There were so many different phenomena that I was looking at here, but we only have a few minutes. So I'm just gonna focus on, just scratch the surface really of one particular topic. That is migrants' perception of their greatest challenge. So unfailingly, every single interviewee reported that finding and maintaining stable employment was if not the fundamental source of stress and challenge to their general well-being. So to be sure, it bears mentioning that in the United States, we are the only country in the world where people seeking temporary protection status or asylum do not immediately have access to job, like work or work authorization, and neither public, like federal benefits, right? So it typically takes about 6 months to get a work permit. In other words, there's this extended period of deliberate, pronounced vulnerability and precariousness that's just baked into the system nationally. A great example of like violent internal bordering, if you will, as scholar Wendy Vogt has put it. I actually have English translations here, if that's helpful to people. Here, I feel the migrant has a lot of support, but they're alone in finding work. Maybe the most important thing. I search, but nothing comes through. Here, without a job, you aren't anything. Holed up in my house, not doing anything, depression hits hard sometimes. And finally, country of dreams? No, this was more like country of nightmares. She was referring at least to that first period of time where she didn't have any work. So many testimonies I heard like this really reflected like the deep existential ramifications of having or not having work on someone's relationship with themselves and the world around them, which is magnified, of course, for a migrant community so disconnected from other sources of identity, who are in almost all cases fleeing generalized conditions of acute material deprivation, who are still beholden to families experiencing that material deprivation, only sometimes to re-experience aspects of it here in the promised land after so much sacrifice. So interestingly, 10 of 12 of these families had actually lived in other Latin American countries for multiple years before migrating to the US. So work experience is like everything else in Denver, sort of mediated or became like a comparative lens, right, for mediating their experiences here or in the country. So experiences in Colombia, Chile, and Peru really informed their perceptions of like either economic advancement or disappointment, right? So if it's frustrating because it's not like Colombia. When I arrived in Colombia, also without resources or anything, the first thing I did was buy a coffee thermos and start selling on the street. Free, free, free. Chile is free. There are street vendors everywhere. You put up a table and sell shirts, hats, sandals, hot dogs, arepa, anything. It was easy to find a job in that city. Here you need papers for everything. Demasiado papeleo. Still, I can earn more here, enough to live and send some money back home. Interestingly, there emerged this interesting parallel between experiences in Latin American countries and also experiences in red states like Texas, where multiple migrants actually reported that jobs were more abundant and accessible, although less desirable. So you hear in Texas or in Texas, any business would hire you without a work permit. No one cared. Shit work, but work. No one cared. Here they do. Here, without a work permit, you're screwed. So observations like these were common and I think really captured the perceptions of this sort of double-edged sword of institutionalized informality compared to Denver's relatively more formal and less porous economic terrain, but with better protections and higher rewards, at least according to the migrants. Nonetheless, in Denver, there still was a ton of informal work happening. Every person I spoke with had, at least at one point, washed windshields or resold flowers like so many Venezuelans at intersections and traffic lights across the city. Typically, like washing windows, you can make anywhere from $60 to $150 on a really good day. Trabajo super duro, right? From sun up to sundown. And then otherwise they would go to Home Depots at the crack of dawn, hoping to pick up a day labor job that would sometimes last an afternoon or maybe a few months if they were lucky. Interestingly, I actually did. I mean, of course, there was a ton of exploitation happening in this context, but more of the stories actually suggested that folks were getting fair wages and had relatively okay relationships with their employers in those spaces. So it was a mixed bag, but it's not all bad. But the inconsistency, I guess, is the biggest thing I want to underscore is they can't hang their hat on having a day labor job the next day, even if it's a well-paying one. Now, of course, work permits did not mean like daisies and rainbows. Far from it. Like the 5 interviewees who did have work permits were often even more frustrated with the lack of opportunities. I mean, even with work permits, like, you know, they still lacked English or like social networks in the city. I mean, you know, Denver didn't have a Venezuelan diaspora before 2022, as goes for most of the United States, right? So workforce centers did help migrants with various trainings, but fell short of actually connecting them with employers directly. So the quote, so all in all, no, where's the, okay. Even having all my papers, I can't find a job. You say that you need someone to work for you. I am here showing you my papers. Give me the opportunity. What more papers do you need? So a lot of frustration you can like just read in those words. So all in all, like to meet monthly costs in the face of just such generalized unreliability and inconsistency of work, people tended to live in shared spaces with other families that they'd often met at, you know, along the journey or at local Denver shelters, employing this dynamic and collective system of like a rotating cast of wage earners. And a quick final note, some of the last series of questions I'd ask at the end of an interview was, what are your plans moving forward? And how do you factor Denver into them, if at all? And interestingly here, there was just a remarkable amount of convergence in the responses. One woman said, my goal is to work and save money here to bring it back one day and be able to make a life. to have my own house and my own business someday in my Venezuela when things are better there, right? So this particular mindset centered on like intermediate financial growth and eventual return seems to have been a characteristic attitude of almost like everyone that I spoke with, who typically saw Denver in their 5 to 10 year plan, with a Venezuelan homecoming out there on the long-term horizon. So this seems like a really important guiding ethos for a lot of people, trying to like stay stable and make sense of things, and in often foreign, lonely, and uncertain terrain. So finally, is Denver a sanctuary or an otra selva, right, or another jungle, in reference to the Darien Gap, which most migrants pass through on their way through from Colombia to through Central America? And the answer is that this is obviously just a completely ridiculous question. There are arguably infinite and often contradictory experiences happening in this context at any given time, often within the same family unit and individual person, right? For this brief presentation, I made the decision to emphasize certain policy limitations and personal challenges I perceive as important. But most of these interviews, reflected positive associations with the city generally, people having benefited significantly from local resources, while over half were already managing to send some money back to their families for often like the first time in like years of traveling. I should note too that last spring, Denver announced that they'd hit their like resource capacity. So they started sending message to migrants in Texas that now Denver is full. They also started offering migrants there who like were unhappy with like their situation or lack of support, resources to go to free transport to go to other cities in the country. So likewise, they shifted their resources from short-term support for everyone to long-term support for a smaller number, closing shelters and opening an asylum seekers program that provides migrants with holistic wraparound services. So case management, free legal support, like full rent coverage for 6 months, job training and job placement, right? But only for about 1,000 households. Like leaving out the vast majority of people, including the folks that I interviewed, making the situation just that much more complicated. So I hope that in my thesis this spring, I could put forward some solutions that can benefit cities like Denver and other cities experiencing similar things, so that they can better approximate this sanctuary ideal, especially more so in the context of the incoming administration, during which city policies are going to matter just that much more for supporting these communities. So with that, I thank you guys so much. You're awesome. Thank you, Tinker-Nave. Thank you, Alberto and Sarah, who's not here. Yeah, really appreciate it.